On a snowy night, trucker Caleb Moore spots a stranded mother, Elena Ramirez, and her two children beneath Harrison Bridge. Ignoring his tight schedule, he stops, offering warmth, food, and a ride to safety. Unbeknownst to him, Elena is the widow of a fallen Marine. His selfless act ripples through the military community, sparking admiration. The next morning, Marines arrive at Caleb's home with honors, revealing connections to Elena's late husband. Who sent them? Why does this simple act resonate so deeply? The mystery of Caleb's impact unfolds, leaving us wondering how far kindness can echo. Love stories of everyday heroes like Caleb? Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of kindness and courage. Your support helps us share stories that remind us of humanity's best. Hit that subscribe button, join our community, and let's keep spreading warmth together. Thank you for watching. The biting wind sliced through the night, carrying flecks of snow that stung like tiny needles against Elena Ramirez's face as she gripped her children tightly, their small bodies trembling against her own. The icy highway stretched endlessly before them, a desolate ribbon of asphalt under a sky heavy with clouds. Each step felt like a battle against the cold, the fear, and the weight of a life that had unraveled too quickly. Elena's arms ached from holding her 6-year-old daughter Lily and her 4-year-old son Max, but she couldn't let go, not when the world felt so unforgiving. Her coat, now draped over her children, left her exposed to the chill, but their warmth was all that mattered. A car roared past, its headlights briefly illuminating their huddled forms. The driver lowered his window, his voice sharp and impatient. "Get out of the way," he barked before speeding off, leaving only the fading glow of taillights and a fresh wave of despair in Elena's chest. She swallowed the sting of his words, her heart sinking deeper into the familiar pit of loneliness. Behind them, the screech of brakes shattered the silence. A massive truck, its engine rumbling like a distant storm, came to a halt. The driver's door creaked open and a figure stepped out, his silhouette tall against the orange pulse of emergency lights. He didn't speak, didn't yell, just stood there for a moment, assessing. Elena's breath caught, a flicker of hope warring with the caution that had become her armor since her world collapsed. The next morning, as dawn broke over the frost-covered town, 3 military vehicles rolled into the narrow alley where the truck driver lived, their engines idling with purpose. Who had sent them, and why? Caleb Moore's dashboard clock glowed 11:47 p.m., casting a faint light across the worn interior of his 18-wheeler as it rumbled over Harrison Bridge. The temperature gauge read -5 degrees Celsius, and the radio crackled with urgent warnings about a sudden Sunday night snowfall that had turned the roads treacherous. At 42, Caleb was no stranger to nights like this. 2 decades of hauling cargo across the country had taught him to read the roads like a book, each curve and shadow telling a story of danger or safety. His face, weathered by years under the sun and wind, bore lines that spoke of long nights and longer days. Before trucks, he'd been a military mechanic, not the kind who charged into battle, but the kind who kept the machines running so others could. It was a quiet role, but it had shaped him, instilling a code he carried into civilian life. Help when you hope then, and no questions asked. As his headlights swept across the underside of the bridge, Caleb's eyes caught a faint flicker. A sedan, its hazard lights pulsing weakly, its hood raised like a white flag of defeat. Beside it, a woman stood, her shoulders hunched as she wrapped her coat around 2 small figures. Cars sped by, their drivers oblivious or unwilling to stop, their taillights vanishing into the snowy void. Caleb's mind raced. He was already behind schedule, his delivery window shrinking with every mile. Company policy was clear. Unscheduled stops were a risk, a liability. The logical choice was to keep driving, to prioritize the job that paid his bills. But his hands moved before his mind could argue, downshifting the truck with a low growl as he eased onto the narrow shoulder. The emergency lights cast an eerie glow across the snow, painting the scene in shades of orange and shadow. Elena looked up as the truck's door swung open, her face a mix of exhaustion and guarded surprise. The man who stepped out was tall, his frame solid under a worn jacket, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "Engine trouble?" he called down, his voice steady but kind, cutting through the wind. Elena nodded, clutching Lily and Max tighter. Their faces, pale and streaked with dried tears, held the haunted look of children who had seen too much fear in too little time. Lily's eyes, wide and wary, darted between her mother and the stranger, while Max clung to Elena's leg, his small body shivering despite the coat. "Hop in," the man said, gesturing to the truck's cabin. "Heater works." Elena hesitated, her mind racing with the instincts of a mother alone in the world. "We don't have money for a tow," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, heavy with the shame of admitting her vulnerability. The man's laugh was warm, unexpected, another cloud of breath in the air. "I've got diesel," he said simply. "That's enough." The cabin was cramped, the air thick with the smell of oil and leather, but the warmth was a lifeline. Elena sat with Lily and Max pressed against her, their small hands clutching the edges of the seat as the truck rumbled to life. Caleb didn't ask questions, didn't pry into the story behind their stranded car or their shivering forms. He drove in silence, his focus on the road, but there was a quiet strength in his presence that eased the knot in Elena's chest. 8 miles later, he pulled into an all-night service station, its neon lights a beacon in the snowy darkness. Without a word, he disappeared inside, returning with 3 hot chocolates and sandwiches, placing them on the table before the family with no expectation of gratitude. Elena's throat tightened as she watched her children sip the warm drinks, their faces softening for the first time that night. When it was time to leave, the station attendant had called a relative to pick them up. Caleb reached into the sleeper berth behind his seat and pulled out a worn wool blanket, its edges frayed but soft. "Take it," he said, pressing it into Elena's hands when she tried to refuse. "I don't need it tonight." He asked no names, sought no thanks, and moments later, his truck rolled back into the night, its red taillights fading like dying embers. Elena stood in the station's parking lot, the blanket warm against her skin, watching the truck disappear. 2 months ago, she would have questioned such kindness, her city-honed skepticism dismissing it as a trap. 2 months ago, her husband, Staff Sergeant Michael Ramirez, had still been alive. His death hadn't been the stuff of war movies. No heroic charge, no blazing glory, just a routine patrol in a far-off place, an undetected IED, and a phone call at 3:47 a.m. that shattered her world. Now, Elena was a single mother navigating a battlefield of grief and bureaucracy, fighting for benefits that seemed designed to break her spirit before they helped. Tonight had been different, though. It was Michael's 34th birthday, a day she'd promised Lily and Max they'd honor by visiting his favorite fishing spot to release paper lanterns in his memory. But first, she'd needed to meet a military benefits attorney in Morton County, a meeting that could secure their future. When her aging sedan sputtered to a stop under Harrison Bridge, its engine coughing out its last breath, her phone battery dead and her children shivering in the back seat, Elena had felt the weight of failure settle over her. She'd resigned herself to a night in the freezing car, her heart breaking as Lily whispered, "Are we going to be okay, Mommy?" Then the truck had appeared, its driver a stranger who asked for nothing but gave everything. The next morning, Elena's brother-in-law drove them back to North Point Marine Base, where they'd been living since Michael's death. The familiar gates loomed ahead, a reminder of the life she'd lost and the one she was trying to build for her children. As they passed through security, Lieutenant Stephanie Wilson flagged them down, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Missed you at the meeting yesterday," she said, leaning into the car window, her voice gentle but probing. Elena's heart sank, the weight of the missed opportunity pressing against her chest. She explained the car, the cold, the stranger who'd stopped when no one else would. Stephanie listened, her eyes softening, but there was something else in her gaze, something Elena couldn't quite place. As they drove on, Elena clutched the wool blanket, its warmth a reminder of a kindness she hadn't expected in a world that had felt so cold. In that moment, she didn't know that Caleb's simple act had set something larger in motion, something that would bring 3 military vehicles to his doorstep, their purpose shrouded in mystery. On a snowy evening beneath Harrison Bridge, Elena Ramirez sat in her stalled car, her breath fogging in the cold as worry gnawed at her. Her 6-year-old son, Miguel, shivered in the back seat, his small hands gripping a worn wool blanket like a lifeline. The car had died an hour ago, leaving them stranded on a desolate highway. Elena's mind churned with fear for her son and the lingering grief for her husband Michael, a man who always knew how to fix things. Now it was just her and Miguel, and the weight of that reality pressed heavily on her heart. "Are we going to be okay, Mama?" Miguel asked, his voice trembling with trust. Elena forced a smile, promising they'd be fine, though doubt gnawed at her. Then headlights cut through the storm. Caleb Moore, a truck driver with a weathered face and kind eyes, pulled over without hesitation. He didn't know Elena's story or the significance of the boy in the back seat. He saw a family in need and acted, offering a ride to the service station and draping his blanket over Miguel's shoulders. To Miguel, that blanket was a treasure, a symbol of safety in a world that felt uncertain. Later, in Steph's office, Elena shared the story, her voice thick with gratitude and disbelief. Steph, personnel liaison to Colonel Whitmore, listened intently, her pen pausing as the tale unfolded. Something about the stranger's kindness struck her, a simple act that carried profound weight. "Did you get his name?" she asked. Elena shook her head, but Miguel chimed in, "Caleb, it was on his thermos." Steph's curiosity deepened as she examined the faded military-issue blanket, noting the stenciled initials, CM. "Mind if I look into this?" she asked, sensing something significant. Elena shrugged, puzzled but trusting. "The colonel knew your husband," Steph explained gently. "He'd want to know someone looked out for Michael's family." That evening, security footage from the service station revealed the truck's company logo and number. A call to the dispatcher confirmed Caleb Moore, a former military mechanic now driving for interstate freight lines. The story spread through a Marine message board, the footage captioned, "Honor outside uniform, civilian helps fallen Marine's family." Comments flooded in, Marines and veterans alike moved by the quiet heroism. "This is why we serve," one wrote. "Find this guy and buy him a beer," another urged. Colonel James Whitmore watched the footage in silence, memories of Michael Ramirez flooding back. Michael had saved his life in Fallujah, pulling him from a burning vehicle despite third-degree burns. Losing him to an IED 2 months ago had left a wound that hadn't healed. Now, knowing a stranger had helped Michael's family stirred something deep within him. He ordered 5 volunteers from Baker Company and Caleb's address. Caleb, unaware of the ripples his kindness had caused, returned home to his quiet routine, washing his truck, heating a frozen dinner, settling into his recliner. The next morning, diesel engines woke him. 3 military jeeps idled outside and 6 Marines in dress uniforms approached his door, carrying a wooden box and a framed certificate. Caleb, in a rumpled t-shirt, opened the door to Colonel Whitmore. "Mr. Caleb Moore?" the colonel asked, his voice commanding yet warm. Inside, Whitmore explained, "You helped Elena Ramirez, widow of Staff Sergeant Michael Ramirez, who saved my life in Fallujah." Caleb, stunned, mumbled that he'd only done what anyone would. "Except no one did," Whitmore countered. A young Marine presented a medallion, the Distinguished Public Service Award. "This isn't standard," Whitmore admitted, "but sometimes standard procedure fails to honor what matters." Caleb stood overwhelmed as the weight of his small act settled over him, resonating across a community bound by honor and sacrifice. Caleb Moore stood frozen, his calloused hands gripping the framed certificate as if it might vanish. The words etched in elegant script, "Kindness needs no uniform," seemed to pulse with a weight he couldn't quite grasp. His throat tightened, not from pride but from a quiet, overwhelming disbelief. He'd never been one for attention, never sought it, yet here he was, surrounded by 6 Marines in crisp dress blues, their faces a mix of solemn respect and unspoken gratitude. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the moment carried more than he was ready to hold. "How did you even find me, Himai?" he finally managed, his voice rough, betraying the storm of emotions swirling beneath his weathered exterior. A faint smile flickered across Captain Whitmore's face, his eyes glinting with the kind of knowing confidence only a Marine could carry. "We're Marines, Mr. Moore. Finding things is what we do." The words landed lightly, but they carried the weight of purpose, of a mission fulfilled. Caleb's mind raced back to that freezing night on the highway, the one where he'd seen Elena Ramirez and her kids shivering at the service station. He hadn't thought twice about giving them his spare blanket or buying them sandwiches. It was just what you did when someone was in need. Now, standing in his modest living room, he felt exposed, like the world had shone a spotlight on a moment he'd meant to keep private. Then, the youngest Marine stepped forward, his face still boyish, barely old enough to seem battle-hardened. His voice trembled slightly, but his words were steady. "Sir," he said, addressing Caleb with the reverence reserved for a commanding officer, "what you did, it's why I signed up. To protect people like you, who do what's right without asking for anything in return." Caleb's chest tightened. He wanted to respond, to deflect, to say it was nothing. But before he could find the words, all 6 Marines snapped to attention. Their hands rose in a flawless salute, the kind that spoke of honor forged in discipline and sacrifice. Caleb, a truck driver with no military background, felt his eyes burn. He didn't know how to receive such a gesture, only that it stirred something deep, something he'd never put a name to. Word of the ceremony spread like wildfire. Elena, with her quiet permission, allowed the service station's security footage to be shared, and soon grainy images of Caleb handing over the blanket and sandwiches were plastered across the internet. Photos of the Marine standing tall in his living room followed, shared and reshared tens of thousands of times. Comments flooded in, from veterans who saw their values reflected in Caleb's quiet act to civilians moved to tears by a stranger's kindness. "This is the America I fight for," one wrote in. "No cape, no badge, just humanity at its best." Another simply asked, "Who's cutting onions in here?" The story took on a life of its own, a beacon in a world that often felt dim. Caleb, though, shied away from the spotlight. Television stations called, radio hosts left voicemails, and a major trucking magazine begged for a cover story. He turned them all down, his voice gruff but polite. Fame felt like a coat that didn't fit. One persistent reporter cornered him at a truck stop, her microphone thrust forward like a challenge. Caleb just shrugged, his broad shoulders slumping slightly. "I did what was right," he said, his tone final. "Don't need to talk about it." That night, he tucked the medallion and certificate into his bedroom drawer, not on display but safe, a quiet keepsake of a moment he hadn't meant to define him. The next morning, he climbed into his truck, logged his mileage, and hit the highway. The only difference was the new wool blanket folded neatly in his sleeper berth, ready for the next person who might need it. For Caleb, honor wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about doing what was right, even when no one was watching. Life on the road settled back into its familiar rhythm. The same highways stretched before him, the same truck stops with their fluorescent lights and lukewarm coffee, the same solitary meals at roadside diners. But something had shifted, subtle yet undeniable, like a new current beneath the surface of his days. At a fuel station in Nebraska, a fellow trucker slid a few bucks across the counter to cover Caleb's coffee, his eyes avoiding Caleb's as if to say, "I know what you did." In Illinois, a warehouse manager glanced at Caleb's company ID, then extended a hand, gripping Caleb's with a reverence that caught him off guard. Outside Pittsburgh, a state trooper pulled him over for a routine inspection, his eyes narrowing at Caleb's name. "My brother's a Marine," the trooper said, his voice low but warm. "Thanks for what you did." He waved Caleb on, without another word, no further checks needed. The fame faded as fame does, but the respect lingered, quiet and enduring. A week after the Marine's visit, an envelope arrived at Caleb's home. No return address. Inside, on pale blue stationery, was a handwritten note. "Mr. Moore," it began, "my son keeps asking when we'll see the kind truck man again. I told him when we're lucky enough a second time." Elena Ramirez's words were careful, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of a mother's gratitude. "The blanket you gave us now wraps around them for bedtime stories. I tell them it's magical, that it carries the warmth of good people doing right things when no one's watching. Thank you for proving me right when I needed it most." Caleb read the letter twice, his fingers tracing the creases as he folded it carefully and placed it beside the medallion in his drawer. Not for display, but for keeping, a private anchor to a moment that mattered. That weekend in his garage, Caleb mounted the certificate on a simple pine board. He didn't hang it in the living room or above the mantel. He placed it where he'd see it while tinkering with his truck's engine or changing the oil. A quiet reminder, not a trophy. The following Sunday, his route took him past the same service station where he'd met Elena and her kids. As he filled his thermos with coffee, the attendant caught his eye, offering a subtle nod of recognition. When Caleb reached for his wallet, the man waved it away, a silent agreement passing between them. Neither spoke of it, but in that moment, Caleb felt the weight of understanding. Heroism, he realized, wasn't always about grand gestures or daring rescues. Sometimes it was just about slowing down, about seeing someone in need and acting without hesitation. I used to think the world was as cold as that night road, Caleb would later say, his voice soft, almost to himself. Now I'm not so sure. His story wasn't about miracles or fanfare. It was about a single moment of stopping, of choosing to act when it would have been easier to keep driving. People like Caleb don't need cameras or medals. They need their stories told to remind the world that kindness still exists, tucked into the ordinary moments of everyday life. For every person who passes someone in need, too caught up in their own journey to notice, Caleb's story is a quiet challenge to pause, to see, to act. The blanket in his truck, the letter in his drawer, the certificate in his garage, they weren't symbols of glory. They were markers of a life quietly changed and a world made just a little warmer. In the biting chill of a winter night, under a bridge where the snow fell in relentless sheets, Caleb, a long-haul trucker with weary eyes and a heart shaped by years on the road, pulled his rig to a stop. He didn't know Elena or her children, huddled beneath a tattered blanket, their breaths visible in the frigid air. But he saw them, not just their forms, shivering in the shadows, but their humanity, fragile, desperate, and clinging to hope in a world that had turned its back. His decision to stop wasn't born of grand heroics. It was instinct, a quiet nudge from the part of him that still believed in doing what's right, even when no one else would. As he stepped out of his claim, the wind cutting through his worn jacket, Caleb felt a pang of doubt. Could he really make a difference? Yet, as he approached the family, their eyes meeting his with a mix of fear and guarded hope, he knew he couldn't turn away. Elena clutched her children closer, her arms a frail barrier against the cold and the weight of her own despair. She'd long since stopped expecting kindness from strangers. Life had taught her to brace for indifference, to shield her heart from the sting of being unseen. But as Caleb knelt beside them, his voice soft but steady, offering a spare blanket from his truck, something inside her cracked. Not the sharp break of heartbreak, but a slow, aching thaw. The blanket, rough and unremarkable, felt like a lifeline. It wasn't just warmth, it was proof that someone cared enough to stop. Her children, wide-eyed and silent, gripped the edges of the fabric, their small fingers trembling not just from the cold, but from the overwhelming relief of being noticed. To them, Caleb wasn't just a man, he was a moment of salvation, a reminder that the world hadn't entirely forgotten them. Years later, that blanket remains a cherished relic in Elena's family. Its edges are frayed now, patched with mismatched scraps of fabric, each stitch a testament to the care they have taken to preserve it. To her children, it's more than a piece of cloth. It's a symbol of the night their faith in humanity was restored. They can still recall the weight of it draped over their shoulders, the way it smelled faintly of diesel and kindness. Elena too holds it close, not just for its warmth, but for what it represents. A stranger's choice to see her, to acknowledge her struggle when she'd begun to believe she was invisible. She thinks of Caleb often, wondering about the man who carried on with his life, unaware of the ripple he'd created in hers. She hopes he knows the depth of what he gave them, not just a shield against the cold, but a spark of hope that still burns in their hearts. Colonel Whitmore, a grizzled Marine with a reputation for discipline and a hidden well of compassion, heard the story through the grapevine of small-town whispers. It struck him deeply, not as a tale of grand valor, but as a quiet lesson in what it means to be human. In his training sessions, where young recruits sat wide-eyed and eager, he wove Caleb's story into his teachings. Honor, courage, commitment, he'd say, his voice carrying the weight of years in service. These aren't just words we salute. They're choices we make every day, in moments no one else sees. He'd pause, letting the recruits imagine the snowy bridge, the truck's headlights cutting through the dark, the family's trembling hope. To Whitmore, Caleb's act was a mirror held up to the Marines' core values, reflecting not just military ideals, but the universal call to see and serve those in need. He'd watch the recruits' faces, some skeptical, others moved, and hoped they understood. Sometimes it's a civilian's quiet decency that reminds soldiers what they're fighting for. Caleb, meanwhile, continues his life on the road, the hum of his truck's engine a familiar companion. He doesn't dwell on that night, though the memory lingers like a warm ember in his chest. To him, stopping was just what you do, nothing extraordinary, nothing to boast about. He still carries a spare blanket in his cab, tucked behind the seat, just in case. When he thinks about it, which isn't often, he feels a quiet satisfaction, not in being a hero, but in knowing he did what felt right. The medal the Marines gave him sits in a drawer somewhere, rarely looked at, because Caleb doesn't see himself as special. He's just a man who paused when others kept driving, who chose to act when it would have been easier to look away. And yet, in that choice, he became something more. Not to himself, but to those whose lives he touched. The power of Caleb's story lies not in capes or battlefields, but in its simplicity. It's a reminder that heroism doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the ordinary moments, in the decision to stop on a snowy night when the world rushes by. In a society dazzled by the extraordinary, by feats of strength or fame, we might do well to celebrate the understated beauty of everyday kindness. It's the kind of decency that seeks no spotlight, no applause, only the quiet certainty of having done what's right. Caleb's story and the lives it changed stands as a testament to that truth. Even in the coldest moments, warmth can come from the most unexpected places, carried by those who choose to see.